We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to eradicating human slavery, human trafficking, child exploitation, and child sexual abuse material through disrupting networks and applying data technology and advanced analytics and intelligence.
So today, I have the pleasure to be joined by this impressive panel to discuss how anti-human trafficking is an essential part of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG. Corporations that immediately come to mind when we hear the term social responsibility are clothing manufacturers, coffee bean companies. Those are two that come top of my mind. But we're here today to talk about why it's just as important for companies like financial institutions and crypto exchanges, kiosks, payment processing companies, and even retail stores. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce everybody first, and then we'll just jump right into the good stuff. I'd first like to introduce Mary Ho. Mary is a senior program manager and a global supply chains at Diginex, and which is an impact technology company helping organizations solve the world's most pressing ESG and sustainability issues. Mary helps organizations use technology to implement human rights due diligence strategies with a focus on responsible recruitment. And then prior to joining Diginex, Mary was an in-house counsel at UBS Wealth Management, where she advised on investment products and client digital platforms. Mary earned her JD from the University of California at Berkeley and is currently completing a master's degree, LLM, in human rights law at the University of Hong Kong. Next, I'd like to introduce Ronnie Hong. Ronnie is the CEO at the Freedom Seal and our featured keynote speaker at our summit this year. As a survivor of child trafficking, Ronnie is now Ronnie is a leading voice in the fight against modern day slavery. She's given several addresses before the UN General Assembly and is appointed by the UN as a special advisor to the United Nations Global Initiative to fight human trafficking. Ronnie has appeared in numerous broadcast and media interviews, including the Oprah Winfrey Show, CNN, and BBC. And Ronnie created and leads the Freedom Seal, which is a certification for companies fighting against human slavery by committing to mitigate financial crime and modern slavery, which has been adopted by organizations around the world. Next, we have Gary Robuff. Gary Robuff is a senior advisor to Shared Assessments, which is a member-driven organization focused on building secure and resilient third-party risk management programs. He's worked with Shared Assessments since its founding in 2005. And Gary has 45 years experience in the financial services sector, planning and management, including 25 years at JP Morgan Chase, where he retired as Senior Vice President, Electronic Commerce. He's served on the board of directors at multiple companies and organizations, including ISTPA, the NYCE Network, and the Electronic Funds Transfer Association. And Gary has served on the board of trustees at Clark University for 12 years, and 9 of them as the board vice chair and chair of the board's strategic and financial oversight committee. And next we have Jeff Blum. He is the chief investigations and security officer at Love Justice International and also an adjunct professor of criminal justice, master's program in investigations and graduate certificate program in human trafficking. Jeff is an internationally published author, lecturer, and speaker on human slavery and counter-human trafficking interventions, with over 15 years of international experience conducting anti-slavery investigations and operations in over 40 countries. Being the chief investigations and security officer for 2 international NGOs operating in several different countries, Jeff assists with asset protection, business continuity, crisis management, and threat and vulnerability assessments of project areas. And he's also managed the development of an anti-slavery data fusion center, which overseeing the collection of analysis of information for targeted intervention strategies. He's led and directed intervention teams around the world to investigate and recover victims of slavery. Jeff works with law enforcement to provide training programs to build their capacity to identify victims and conduct human trafficking investigations. And now me, I'm Jennifer Moreau. I am responsible for the ESG advisory and the marketing at ATII, which is, we're hosting this summit. I'm also the founder and CEO of World for Good, which is a retail company that sells upcycled products made by survivors and those at risk of slavery and poverty. And it's the first company in the United States to become a certified USA social enterprise. And I started World for Good to reach other women who have gone through or currently going through abuse and exploitation. But in my career prior, I served as the marketing director for a certified B Corporation bank in Florida, and I helped craft their global mission, and I played a critical role as they became the first bank in the Southeast US dedicated to social and environmental responsibility. So I'm able to fuse my core passions of anti-human trafficking and ESG together at ATII. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is our panel. And I would like to get started right now and just to kind of set the foundation. So we're, as maybe you don't know, but we're here to talk about implementing environmental, social, and governance, or ESG practices. And it's a complex undertaking. And to succeed, it has to be supported by a variety of skills and technology. So the panel discussions will include tools for risk management, the collection of strong data and analytics, and why automation is essential to avoid creating new sources of operational complexity in detecting human trafficking. So with that as our foundation of ESG, I'd first like to ask the panel to define ESG and specifically what part of this very broad term we're focusing on for this discussion. So Jeff, could you please start us off?
Yeah, certainly, Jennifer, I'd like to. ESG stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. The S stands for social as far as social responsibility and focuses on the sustainability of an organization, but without doing harm to the people or communities. There are many different components that can be considered under the social aspect, and some of them that companies must consider are community development. How is your company affecting the local communities and what initiatives your company can implement? Some examples are community betterment programs, clean water systems, permanent housing solutions, sanitation improvement, and poverty reduction initiatives. Another aspect is health and safety. This deals with the impact of your corporate on the health and safety of the local community as a whole, but also the individual workers. Some initiatives might be clean air and water programs, food security, and health education programs. Another component is human rights. Do the laborers have the right to exercise freedom of choice in their work? Do they have freedom of movement to seek other employment? Do they experience abusive work conditions or environments? Ensuring local suppliers are not using enslaved or exploited labor and not using exploitative or abusive work conditions or coercive measures to keep the labor from leaving. The next one is inclusion and diversity. This is important because what is the current demographics of the labor force and how does it reflect the local community? Corporate policy regarding staffing and gender inequality initiatives should be followed. And how is the local community and the sub-tier suppliers fitting in with these initiatives? And the last one I want to point out is fair labor standards and working conditions. Does the supplier promote fair labor standards, fair wages, set safe work hours, safe working environments? And so it is no longer about maximizing profits, but also about prioritizing sustainable supply chain practices to ensure long-term growth and longevity. The rise of ESG points to a fundamentally new way of doing business. ESG has actually taken hold, and many companies include some form of ESG in their mission statement and use third-party evaluations to score their efforts. And from an ESG perspective, the supply chain represents the largest potential ESG risk for most companies, yet the biggest area to make a positive impact in those communities it's involved in. Companies tend to focus on the most relevant components of ESG, mainly based upon the economic or stakeholder pressures that they feel, and should only really participate in programs that are related to their ultimate focus. Companies shifting how they buy can actually fundamentally change the world we live in. Most companies typically only know their direct suppliers, which means that sub-tier suppliers are invisible, buried in a labyrinth of supply chain network tiers. As an example of this complexity of the multi-tier supply chain, one agricultural supplier may be linked to 100 sub-tier suppliers. Or the apparel industry may involve many sub-tiers involving 50 plus suppliers from 20 different countries. What this means is that there is a very high risk of trafficking or exploited labor, safety and security issues, and unfair working conditions in these sub-tier networks that we need to look at and evaluate.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why, you hear over and over again how human trafficking is the most undetected crime because it's hidden away in the supply chains, it's hidden away really everywhere. And recently the EU announced in their strategy on combating trafficking in human beings, they initiated a public review of their anti-trafficking directive, which is based on the findings of an evaluation, and they aim to modernize their rules and their legislation there. And I know quite a few of you on the panel are pretty into this and know a lot about it. So I would like to ask Mary and Gary, do you want to elaborate on what the EU is doing?
Mary, you want to have at it?
Sure, great. I think this has been a long progression towards where the EU has got to now, and starting with just the basis was the UN guiding principles that has been adopted for about a decade now. And over time, we've seen governments kind of put that into practice where businesses have the duty to respect human rights, and the UN guiding principles really set out standards for how businesses can conduct human rights due diligence and identify areas where they impact human rights directly and offer remediation to parties that are impacted by their business, but also an expectation that they look at their business relationships and go down deeper, as Jeff was mentioning, in terms of going beyond just the tier one. So we've seen global legislation to kind of start off in terms of the Modern Slavery Act in the UK and also in Australia, where there was expectations for how companies are addressing this issue, but those were primarily disclosure requirements. And then we've seen more progression for different governments, including France with their, I guess it's called the French duty of vigilance, and also the Dutch duty of care in terms of looking at child labor. But the EU really saw that there's too much fragmentation in different standards that companies are being expected to abide by. So I think the EU legislation is really a step in the right direction to kind of harmonize and set standards where it gives more clear guidance, but it's also quite powerful in terms of being a mandatory legislation. There's definitely some critique of the EU legislation in terms of its focus areas and having certain, I guess, leaving out SMEs, but focusing on certain high-risk industries, which particularly in the textiles industry and agriculture are considered high risk. Gary, do you want to also mention anything about?
Yeah, so let me just mention a couple of things. The first time I read the directive proposal, I was struck by the fact that we're used to thinking about scope 3 emissions, right, in the environmental space. And what this proposal does is it takes the notion of scope 3 emissions everything forward and backwards from an organization itself, and it jumps the tracks into human rights, which is pretty unprecedented. And it does that in a lot of different ways. When you read the regulation, you see terms like value chain, and the definition of a value chain makes very clear activities related to the production of goods and provisions of services by a company, including the development of the product or service and the use of and disposal of the product, as well as the related activities of upstream and downstream established business relationships of the company. All right, and it makes it clear it should encompass upstream established direct and indirect business relationships. So, and it does this and incorporates pretty precise due diligence requirements, including, definition of what an auditor has to do. And it's been, and the regulation has been criticized for that. When you think about, and it's also been criticized, and again, it sort of hangs together with some of the auditing questions. You think about double materiality, right? Where the first definition of materiality, what we're used to thinking of as materiality, is very much related to finance. But the double materiality, the second stream of materiality, is really how an organization's activities impact the entire human rights and all of the S in ESG. And the metrics are different, right? So one of the things that I was glad to see is that recently, when the Judiciary Committee reviewed the proposal, they extended the implementation dates a year to 2005 and 2006. And I think one of the rationales for doing that is, number one, to make sure that everybody understands what the metrics are going to be in the S area of ESG, and then understand how due diligence is going to be done, because the due diligence requirements in this regulation are pretty strict, and I love it. It is a jump of some significance, I think. And this is a little bit off the topic, but if you look at the language in some of the SEC's new climate proposal, a lot of it mirrors what's here. It's the same, value chain discussion, everything, and it's all the way soup to nuts. So I think it's exciting.
Yeah, and Ronnie, I know you've been involved in legislation here in the U.S. How do you tell us how U.S. compares to what we've heard about over in Europe?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer, for this opportunity to be able to speak here and along with my panelists. And so very interesting, right? I think USA, just most recently, about a month ago or so, I testified before U.S. Congress asking, speaking about the challenge of products coming in from, let's say, specifically from China into the United States. So the USA legislation has been very hot on this most recently, because they're putting an implementation date of, June 21st. We're talking about a month or 2 months away. And I think a lot of these multinational companies are challenged. It's not so much on the financial industry as it is to the manufacturers and multinational companies, but everybody's going to be impacted, right? So the USA legislation, I have been working on this issue now for over 20 years, started in the United States, and US, I'm happy to say, they're catching up and they're getting involved, which is great, because that's the first step, right? But I think more of my work is when I did a keynote speech for the United Nations, the UN, General Assembly. And in 2018, I remember bringing this subject up, right? And this was just being talked about. And around that time is when really, I believe, the financial institutions really started to pay a little more attention, you might say. And so I really felt like and for that particular, it was UK government, USA government, Canada. So I was speaking to many of the governments and how do we move forward in this? And so I think from a global perspective, we definitely are getting the legislation there. I also testified before the EU several years ago, back in 2017-18, saying the EU, let's discuss about this. This is going to be an important issue. we do need to address the supply chain. So I remember speaking before the Human Rights Committee on this whole issue, and that's just when they were considering a lot of this. I'm so happy to see, as you can see, EU, business and human rights, and the different laws that are coming. So I think from a global perspective, we're doing a great job. We're bringing it down to the country level, as our panelists have mentioned, and look forward to working with all governments in advancing the ESG. And I really do focus on the S, right? Of course, as a survivor of human trafficking, I believe the S is very important. So are the other elements, but S in the social. So that is why I'm here to learn from my panelists and to be able to speak with this company here, and look forward to our further conversations.
Thanks, Ronnie.
Can I add one of the important aspects that has really become unique in the U.S. is that the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol has really amped up their enforcement and use of the withhold and release orders. And so there's currently 54 active WROs, which is really blocking companies from allowing imports into the U.S. that may that they suspect have been made with forced labor. And I think one of the most high-profile cases was really around a Top Glove that was blocked from bringing in about $55 million worth of goods. That was in 2021, and that really caused a drop in their share value. And I think that's where investors and banks and financial institutions need to really pay attention, because they need to do due diligence into these companies because it will impact their bottom line.
Yeah, that's a great example, Mary. I'm glad you brought that up. And so there are a lot of companies that are already doing like financial reporting by design. So they're used to doing that type of reporting, and they have software that's embedded into their companies. But do you all think that in a decade or maybe less, that it'll be the same with ESG, like as far as the reporting and it just being like a normal, oh yeah, we have to do this quarter. What do you all think about that? Do you think that's even a possibility? And also, Ronnie, I would like to also, in this segment, I would really like you to talk about your Freedom Seal certification, because it kind of goes into this, but I wanted to open it up to the other panelists, Jeff, and do you think that ESG reporting is going to be common, just like financial reporting?
Yes, I think it will be more common, especially as the stakeholders, which we'll get into later, excuse me, get involved. I mean, some of the stakeholders, the customers being the biggest drivers of these things, as they become more aware and are conscious about what's taking place in these supply chains, they're going to be more selective on where they spend their money. That's ultimately going to impact the bottom dollar of those corporations. Just an example, I mean, I've recently done an investigation here in the US. I can't really tell you where, it's still ongoing, but I was investigating labor trafficking in a southern state where I was following around migrant laborers who were here legally, but they were being exploited in companies that were second-tier suppliers to one of the largest retailers in this country and to a large auto manufacturer. And we're talking 400 to 500 individuals in a town of no more than 20,000 people. And so, yeah, this is going to have a big impact. It's around us, and as more people become aware of it, I think it will drive a push to see more, especially the social involvement, and especially as the shareholders and the boards see a drop in their income shares, and the people are moving to different companies because of this.
Just one point that I'm actually at a conference now, and there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that younger employees, as they come in for interviews, one of the questions they're asking is about ESG, and they want to understand the company for whose position they're interviewing for, how serious they are. So another reason why I think you're going to see ESG reporting become much more common is that I think employees are going to demand it. And I think that's going to work its way naturally up organizational hierarchies, because I think that it's a real standard, significant change in our values.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to add to that. I'm sorry, Gary. And so that's a very good point, because I was at an event speaking in the United States, And I was talking to one of the biggest, largest banks here. And it was interesting because they're the ones saying, how do we get these young people, the next generation of bankers, involved in this issue? And it was a challenge between the different age group, but we saw that there was a need. And so I did, I created the Freedom Seal. Freedom Seal is an actual certification, a solution to companies who can evidence prevention of human trafficking, prevention of forced labor within supply chains. And it's not, we have to start somewhere. I like to say it's a journey. Like, this work is not easy, but it's a journey and we need to start somewhere. So I created the Freedom Seal to help the companies, give them the technology tools needed to do their job. But when we looked at it first, we were really looking at it from a manufacturing point of view, because that really was the hot topic of the day. But as we getting into this more, we realized that financial institutions were greatly, were silent in some ways, but yet this digital, we talk about digital wallet, we talk about money that's being watched, follow the money, right? Follow the money to find the trafficking situations. And so within that, so Freedom Seal came out with a very specific questionnaire, criteria, set the global standards for the financial institutions, which then they can take it into their different departments and go through our process. But I felt like that we needed something to raise the bar. We needed something that the whole world, can look at this and say, how can we, if we're going to win business, they got to compete, and they got to compete ethically, right? We're here to enforce the ethical sourcing and all that we know about. So I really do think that, with the Freedom Seal and with the different solutions that all of our panelists are bringing to the table, will really give the tools for the compliance officers. We talk about, the banks talk about know your customer, right? So when they're doing the screening of their customer, in the past, they haven't been looking for the issue of human trafficking. But I think now we are definitely getting the question saying, how do we do this? And for sure, we have to be able to report on it and what we're doing. So I believe our frameworks, our solutions are an incredible opportunity to raise the bar, educate everyone, and then work together as stakeholders. So that would be my 2 cents of where we are and where we're going to be, and look forward as the ESG conversation advances and bring in the forefront of the issue.
Thank you. I'd like to add that, the bottom-up approach is very important in terms of getting stakeholders, but then we also see the top-down approach where the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, is also looking into mandating ESG reporting into all listed companies. And I think that will be really powerful and effective in terms of driving ESG reporting for across all businesses. And then there's also quite a large number of benchmarking and standards reporting frameworks that have been promulgated around the world, like GRI, SASB. But we also see a trend towards recognizing that there's too many standards, and people are coalescing around having a single standard, much like the accounting standards have primarily 2 different standards of reporting, so that there could be more comparability between the risks that people are identifying. And I think this is a growing trend that people see, that we need to mandate this and also and have common standards so that everybody's speaking the same language.
So the issue of Rana, you were going to say something.
Yeah, just to add to that, it is challenging with the definitions, right? The definitions varies around the world. And this is one of the big challenges we had even at the UN. It's like, how do we come up with one standard or standards that the world will listen to? And so I think Mary's absolutely right. It's an area we definitely need to grow, just like statistics. The statistics are many different places, but really coming to a common ground where we are those who work in this movement can contribute. But definitely the definitions, the statistics is a challenge, but it does not give us an excuse not to address this issue. So I definitely think what Mary said is very important as the panelists and as the people who are listening in our audience to really as to work together with the stakeholders to really come up with something that's more tangible.
And I new directive is going to have the effect of forcing standards consolidation. So by the time we get to 2006, there have got to be common metrics, and it'll be interesting to see how that happens.
Absolutely.
And besides having a common standard, what other challenges do you think businesses have, financial institutions, crypto exchanges? What other challenges do they have in the positive social impact? So they can say, well, we don't know what type of assessment to use, or we don't know which one to use, so we're just not going to do it because it's too confusing. What are the other challenges besides that, do you think?
So I think one challenge is reporting information that is not accurate. And the kind of due diligence that someone has to do, especially think about complex supply chains, which is what we've been talking about. If you're really going to examine a supply chain, and you're going to go all the way to the end on upstream and even look at downstream impacts. Boy, I tell you, the kind of due diligence that you need to do to make sure that the information that you are reporting that is not local to your organization, that's a heavy task. And I think questions about how you do that and what organizations need to begin to tackle some tasks on behalf of many companies, that's the way I think you're going to see this get done. If every company has to do its own due diligence completely on a one-off basis, it's going to be very tough. But if people come together and form entities that have the ability to do good due diligence and then share that information broadly, it's going to be very helpful.
And I will mention something. As I've been speaking around the world in different companies and banks, in my last event that I was speaking at, they were really asking for practical tools. They love the big idea, and yes, we need to fight modern day slavery, and we need to do this. But sometimes, they were getting overwhelmed. So I think we really need to deliver the practical tools. We know where the problems and challenges are. We're still figuring some out, but really we also at the same time need to bring solutions. So I'm very happy, on this panel, I know every one of us have software tools and different tools to be able to bring step by step. And I know even for my own, that was the big challenge. And so Freedom Seal certification, of course, takes them through very specific questions and specific criteria that they can work on, and then evidence what they are doing. But I think it is important for our audience to realize we don't expect this issue to go away tomorrow, right? I mean, as a survivor of human trafficking, I absolutely would like to see that. But practically, I know we need all to do our part and take action. And I think if we can really remember that, bringing the solutions is the key, and education will make a difference as we move forward.
So I just wanted to comment further about the challenges that businesses face, and I think particularly in the financial industry. Banks aren't really recognizing the S as much as they should be as a real risk for them. I think a lot of banks still have focus maybe in the project finance area where they might evaluate social risks, but they do need to see that it's actually a risk in all industries. We focus a lot on supply chain work and particularly manufacturing, but really modern slavery risks can occur in anywhere where you might have outsourced labor, including immigrant labor or low wage labor, because, for example, in hospitality, there's risks of the workers being exploited who are the low wage cleaners. A lot of times it's an issue around not knowing where your labor comes from because you rely on a third party to recruit your labor, and then not recognizing or having contracted labor where you hire the security agency or cleaning agency to provide the labor, but not really doing enough due diligence about their practices and how they are treating their employees and the contractual requirements that they should be following in terms of ensuring fair treatment to workers. And I think the second issue is that, one, they don't recognize that it is an issue they should look at, and two, once they do recognize it, they're not sure what questions to ask and how to do due diligence. And so there are a lot of tools that are available. It's definitely an area that we are helping to digitize in terms of helping companies ask the right questions, but also cascade that due diligence beyond the first tier, beyond just their direct business relationship, to ask them to also due diligence on their business partners downstream. So I think that's the challenge right now, is for companies to go beyond due diligence on the first tier level and go deeper into how workers are being recruited and potentially exploited to address the risk of modern slavery.
And there are even software coding concerns there. I think banks are becoming aware of those in places and parts of China where people are actually doing that at a very low rate and in forced circumstances. It's becoming a broadly known issue, I think. So I would expect there to be that there would be progress soon.
And so just comment on the challenges. Jennifer, you were asking the challenges, and as we know, there are many. But I think when I was working and doing a lot of speeches at the United Nations General Assembly, the issue of global standardization topic came up often, right? Because everybody knew this was a challenge. Every country had different standards, different criteria, different definitions. So that is what actually drove me to create the Freedom Seal certification, because in that I addressed the global standards. And what we did is we took the best out there, so our modern day slavery, we brought up modern day slavery standards as widely known. We took the business and human rights, internationally known as the UN Guiding Principle, the OECD guidelines, and other internationally accepted standards, and we looked at it from a lens saying, okay, now how can we put this together in a global standardization that everybody can go by, because there wasn't one specifically for modern day slavery. So that's what we did. Freedom Seal did that with the experts, many experts, including the financial institutions. We included the private sector in developing this. And so I'm happy and proud to announce that these standards will come out in the next 2 months. We have it finished, we've tried it, and now we will publicly announce it on July 30th for World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. So definitely challenges, but the solutions are coming, and I encourage the audience to continue watching this and as we pull this out, bring this out again.
What a wonderful conclusion. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for your time and your expertise around ESG and how it relates to anti-human trafficking. So to close out, I would love it if each of you could give our audience one piece of advice about reporting or benchmarking or improving their ESG initiatives, like something they can do today, something they can start with. Jeff, you want to start us off?
Sure, I'll start you off. Excuse me. Initiating protocols for monitoring and auditing the suppliers is just the beginning. What they really need to do is create effective remediation plans, because without these remediation plans, things are going to continue on. So if you're finding a supplier or someone who is not following your protocols and not following your standards and your supply chain ethics, then you need to do something about it. You need to have a remediation plan in place. And through this, the company can actually mitigate any legal risks and damage to brand reputation while improving overall working conditions and building sustainability of their supply chain.
Great. And what about you, Gary?
My advice would be, don't worry about which standard you select or to report. Many people believe that over the next 18, 24 months, we're going to see convergence of standards. Select standards that foot to what your organization believes is important. Use them. No regulator is going to hold it against you if your standard disappears or consolidates in 18 months. Do the right thing now.
Nice. And what about you, Mary?
I would say, yeah, get started because it's not going away. There may be a lot of information that people aren't aware about in ESG, but starting to collect the data, getting, as Gary mentioned, just getting started is the first step. And I also agree with Jeff that remediation is a very key component of ensuring that you have an early warning signal in terms of problems that are in place, and so that you can get those information directly from workers and having a way for them to communicate their concerns upwards, so that they can be addressed is a very important facet.
Absolutely. And Ronnie, what is your advice?
To the audience that's listening to us, to the financial institutions, I ask you to lead above the bottom line. People are important. We never want to take that for granted. Buying and selling people is illegal, and we know that, but what do we do? And so I encourage our audience, take action today, one action. And that, as we know, there's numerous evidence-based business cases that show what we need to do. So monitor and manage your supply chains and tackle human rights issues. And then together, we can make a difference. So start the conversation, join us, and follow us on social media.
Nice. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jen.